thanks to those of you who came out and braved the weather. Appreciate it. I'm just glad to be talking to Gabino and talking about this book, which is incredible. Gabino and I go back a bunch of years now, though we've only met in person one other time here in Oxford for the Oxford conference for the book a few years ago, when I invited him here to be on a kind of noir panel that I put together for the conference. But we have similar kind of publishing histories. I know him from our small independent publisher, Broken River Books, who published Gabino's first two books and my first two books. And I think that's how we first kind of got to know each other online. Those first two books, Zero Saints and Coyote Songs, also went on to be translated into some other languages. And my first book, Gravesend, went on to be translated into some other languages. So we have similar kind of paths to where we're at. And now Gabino's got this great new novel published by Mulholland, which is one of the best presses around if you're a fan of crime fiction, noir, and they publish Jim Thompson's catalog and Joe Lansdale and Jordan Harper now, and just a bunch of great writers. I could keep listing there. Dwayne Swarzinski. There's so many people who are published by Mulholland, and Gabino now joins their ranks, and it's a perfect match, I think. So, like I said, I'm thankful that you guys came out. I'm thankful that Gabino drove here to be with us, and I'm really excited to talk about this book, which is terrific. And sometimes when you do these things, for me anyway, it's stressful when it's been a while since I've read the book, because I don't have a great memory, and so if it's been 6 months since I've read the book and I'm trying to talk about it, it's not very fresh in my mind. So I wanted to hold off on reading this until right before this, basically, so it could be very, very, very fresh in my memory. And so I've read it basically in the last week or so, and so it's all really super in the front of my mind right now. And I was totally blown away by it. So I have a million kind of scattered notes and a million scattered things I'd like to talk about. But I'm going to try to stay focused, just kind of keep it down to a handful of questions that I hope make some sort of sense, and then open it up to questions. And really, as I'm not doing a good job of right now, have me talk less and Gabino talk more. So I'll shut up in a second. But the first thing I wanted to ask about is just kind of I think one of the things that really struck me about this book is that it's kind of it feels almost like kind of a punk rock kind of like catharsis. It's full of it's, first of all, it's not a slow burn novel. It's a novel that I think is just kind of just right out of the gate, loaded with momentum and doesn't let up. I mean, it takes place over a relatively small span of time. It's first person, and maybe I should talk just a second about the setup, or I'll let Gabino talk about the kind of setup for the book, the synopsis, so I don't give too much away. But I want to talk about just kind of the origins of the book, where the idea came from, how you decided to stick with one point of view, which I think the other books are, right? Because both Zero Saints and Coyote Songs are...
Zero Saints kind of is. Coyote Songs has 6.
Okay, yeah, I guess that's what I was remembering, that one. How you decided to stick with that one point of view, and just kind of obviously there's, one of the things I love is when I feel like a writer is just kind of getting everything they know into a book, everything they want to say into a book. And I feel like that this book is a thrilling kind of crime narrative, but it's also loaded with ideas about class, race, the American dream, the border, you name it. And injecting all of that stuff into the book constantly. So where did the idea come from? Where did you start? What was the process like of writing it? And anything you want to say about kind of the origins of the project?
I love when people say I'm not prepared and they got notes. makes me feel wildly unprepared. I moved to the U.S. in 2008, and since then I was a teaching assistant at the University of Texas at Austin. I taught ESL classes to undocumented workers at Progresso School in Austin. I was a high school teacher for 2 years. I wrote for the Austin Post for about a year and a half. I sold life insurance for Citizens Inc. I could go on and on and on. So between all those gigs, I think between 2008 and 2022, I've been uninsured like half of that time. Obviously, the smaller gigs and the teaching stuff doesn't have health insurance, and I was never that worried. It never sort of scared me, and then I had a kid, and I was like, oh crap. Now I'm afraid of all the things that the world can do to you all of a sudden. And I'm sure if you got kids, you felt that way before. You're no longer just living for you, you're living for somebody else. And that was the seed for this book, which I started writing while teaching high school, which was a relatively comfortable time because I knew exactly how much money I was going to get every single month, and I had health insurance. And it felt really nice. And then in March of 2020, they said, we don't have a contract for you in August. Best of luck. God bless. And then I was like, all right, so what now? And the world said, now nothing. No one's going to hire anybody. There's no job fairs to go to. Sit your ass at home and write. So I spent between March and maybe the middle of June hours every day on Indeed trying to send out resumes. That wasn't working out, and I said, I'm angry, I'm scared, I'm frustrated, I don't like our healthcare system. Maybe I should use all of this as fuel to finish that novel, which I wrote the first 40,000 words in my 30-minute lunches at school while eating a sandwich, typing with one hand, and suddenly I had time. So that was the good part. The silver lining of that situation was having time to write. And between, I don't know, July and October, which is unheard of for me because I'm a really slow writer, I finished it and sent it off to an agent. So the idea was all of the things that normally make me angry or unhappy, to pack them into a single story. And to talk about, because Pseudo Saints and Criollo songs talked a lot about migration, but I think I was neglecting a little bit of the privilege that comes from having an American citizenship, which I have as a Puerto Rican. I'm a second-class citizen. I can't vote for the president. We have no representation almost, but we have, as soon as we're born, we get a blue passport. And I was, all right, it's time to bring this in, build a different type of character that allows me to punch racists on a page, which is therapeutic.
Yeah, so let's talk about the character, because the book is about all this other stuff that I just mentioned that is kind of tied up in the narrative. But at the heart of the book is this one character, Mario, who I don't want to give too much away about the actual plot, but basically his life falls apart at the beginning of the book, and he has an incredible loss and is basically thrust into in kind of I think a grand noir tradition, a good person thrust into a bad situation, or somebody who is up against a wall and suddenly has to make bad decisions. It's either die broke, or do bad things to survive. And so that's basically what the kind of narrative arc of the book is, that this guy's life, Mario, falls apart, and he's kind of pushed into a position where he's got to do some stuff, some bad stuff for money. So I want to talk about him as kind of a noir character, as somebody who you know, like I said, is a good man, I think, at heart, who's forced to do bad things. So, you know, he's somebody, you know, he does some really bad things in the book, actually. Like, not just, there's all sorts of kind of ethical questions he tangles with throughout the narrative, and some of the things he does, he can justify, and some of the things he does, he can't quite justify. But it's always kind of in the name of survival and you know, just kind of getting by. But can you talk about Mario a little bit, and just kind of what you were thinking of and how he fits into this? Because I think he does fit into this mold of a kind of you know, classic noir kind of, I guess, anti-hero.
Yeah.
If I'm using that word correctly.
You should know, you're the more maestro. No, absolutely right, and you mentioned normal people being thrown into bad circumstances. I love crime fiction, noir, and I love horror, and I think they share that, because horror is like you moved into the haunted house.
Yeah.
You're not a bad person, you're trying to protect your animals and your kids, and the demon's gonna get you all. In this case, it was, I'm tired of good guys and bad guys.
Yeah.
And talking to people and knowing real humans. I mean, we don't have to go to the extreme of like John Wayne Gacy would dress up as a clown to go make money to help kids, right?
Right.
So he was a super nice person. We don't have to go to that extreme to know that we all have our dark side, and sometimes it's somebody messes with your kids, that dark side comes out. Someone cuts you up in traffic and you've had a bad day, the dark side comes out. But I think we've built a system that tends to push us from different places constantly, whether it's culturally or politically or financially. And when you reach that breaking point, there's almost no reason to hold it in anymore.
Yeah.
And I think Mario reaches that point and he's like, I'll kill people for money, because why not?
Yeah.
And he does a lot of mental gymnastics to convince himself that these people deserve it.
Yeah.
And once you manage to develop that skill, you can find reasons to. I would go out and punch Ted Cruz right now, because I've convinced myself that he deserves it.
Yeah.
It's illegal. It's a bad thing to do. I would go to jail. But you know, mentally, I've done the exercise, and Mario does those exercises, and at some point, you don't have to do them anymore. It's just like, this is what I need to do, so I'll take care of business. And I think noir does that. It's sort of, well, we didn't, you know, take heist novels. We didn't want anybody to die, but once the first person died, we just killed 7 cops. Because things went south, and we needed to escape. And I think he gets there very early, and is surprised by the ease with which, you know, he embraces that darkness and moves forward.
Yeah, it's great, and it's, you know, I mean, I think it's one of, like, as I said, one of my favorite things about the book is this kind of ethical, you know, battle raging within him throughout, because there's not, you know, and I'm with you, I don't like one-dimensional good guys or one-dimensional bad guys at all, and I don't like, you know, people who kind of, you know, I think we've all seen kind of to death or read to death one-dimensional kind of hero who has a code. But I think one of the interesting things this book does is that it kind of, you know, puts you in Mario's shoes in terms of asking yourself questions about, you know, if in a rigged system, in a fucked world, like, is it, you know, where you've seen over and over again that there is no justice, that there's very little mercy, is it possible to retain any sort of code? And I think that's something he's kind of always battling with, which is one of the things I really love about the book. That, and you know, but he is somebody that you don't, you feel for throughout the book. I mean, he's not always, I guess, a sympathetic figure, but he's always somebody that you're with. I mean, I don't think you ever kind of, even when he's doing terrible things, you kind of get it, because you understand what he's going through in his mind. So yeah, he's a he's the backbone of the book, obviously, the main character. As I said, it's a, you know, I've never written a book that's first person, you know, all the way, one character, and you know, I love many books that do that. You know, when I sit down to write, I find it difficult to pull that off. I've tried, and it just hasn't worked out. But I think in this book, you know, I can't think of many recent examples that pull it off as well or better. You know, I mean, just really hooked me to his voice and stayed with me all the time. And you talked about, I want to kind of jump off of that and get back to what you were saying, because you brought up horror, and I think, you know, I think when you read about Gabino's work, I think you'll probably, if you read reviews or read interviews or anything, you'll see people use phrases like genre defying or, you know, whatever. Because, and I think this is a place we really connect to. He's somebody who does, you know, is all over the place, kind of in terms of influences and interests and inspirations and another thing I love about this book is that it's not just a straight crime novel or straight noir. It's, you know, it's loaded with horror, and it's loaded with kind of other touches and other genres, and it, you know, there are places that this book goes that you certainly wouldn't expect in kind of a more formulaic kind of crime narrative, I think. So you talk a little bit about where these, you know, especially I guess horror and noir, but I know your interests go way beyond that. You know, talk about influences and just kind of what you were thinking in terms of combining all that stuff in this book.
Sure. Surprise! I wasn't the best kid at school, so I was getting kicked out of classrooms, and the only place for me to go was the library. It was a tiny library. You've seen those at, you know, small schools where it's like the shelves only go up to the windows, and the librarian would let me just peruse and pick something up and start reading. I think it was about 10 or 12, and I picked up Horacio Quiroga's Tales of Love, Madness, and Death, and I was like, what in the world is this thing? And then, you know, as a reviewer, as someone who's involved in publishing, I understand how clear-cut middle grade fiction is now and how clear-cut YA fiction is now. My middle grade and my YA was Lovecraft, Poe, Stephen King, Richard Lehman, Bentley Little. So that was the first big, you know, literary love, and school wasn't doing much work for me in terms of English, which is not my first language. So once I started reading Lovecraft, I was like, I don't know what this guy's saying. So I got a tiny dictionary, and horror taught me English. So I read, and what I read I didn't understand, I would go translate it. And then I discovered crime fiction, and I was like, they share that black heart that we're talking about normal people being thrown into awful circumstances. They are the two most beautiful, you know, dancing partners. But when I start writing my own stuff, I want to make them dance together. And obviously along the way it was something that you're not supposed to do. Because they're two different genres and they operate under very different things. But I kept, you know, reading, and then I discovered magical realism. And I was like, this is the glue. All right? It's like, okay, this is the supernatural, the stuff not supposed to happen, the ghosts and the werewolves and the haunted houses and the demons and the witches and vampires. And this is like bad guys with guns and you know, good people doing bad things for money. If I just use this as the glue, I can bring the two genres that I love together. And I've been doing that, I don't know, since before Zero Saints. So probably a decade, a little bit more. And at some point, people stopped asking questions. They just gave up. It's like, this is what you're gonna do. Fine, go for it. It's so much fun because if you start working in that interstitial space between reality and fiction, you never know what's happening. You feel a little bit insecure. You're like, all right, so there's a cartel. I can understand a cartel. I can see the guys. I understand how guns operate. But if you have to go underground to get the thing done, and there's these weird creatures underground, we're beyond fucked, because now it's like, they don't even need guns to eat us alive.
Yeah.
And that's just fun for me. And a long time ago, I heard the great Stephen Graham Jones say that genre fiction was a cake.
Yeah.
And so you have the stuff that's shiny and colorful that goes up on top of it, that you know, beckons to people, like, come taste this. And then they slice into that cake, and you're like, oh wow, this is about identity and politics and migration and all this other stuff that's very serious. But the stuff on top is like the monsters and the visions, and it allows me to try to entertain and at the same time get away with saying all the stuff that I want to say about racism, for example, which is not something you want out up front. Like, here's a book about racism, do you want to read it? No, God, no. So it allows me to have a lot of fun. So.
Yeah, and it is really, I mean, you know, one of the things, as a fan, I mean, I think one of my favorite things in both books and films is kind of, you know, gear shift stories, you know, stories that can turn tonally from one thing to another thing very quickly. And I think this book kind of does that in some just really exciting ways where you are, you know, I think early on especially, there's some hints of it, but then it goes to some really places that I just wasn't anticipating in some very dark and you know, profoundly unsettling ways. You know, and it's amazing. You know, it's a great feeling to be launched kind of sideways or launched in a different direction than you know what you thought you were getting. You know, maybe you thought you knew where this story was going, or maybe you thought you knew how this would play out because you've read, you know, stories about the border and you've read stories about the cartels, and you know you've got some grounding in more kind of traditional, you know, crime fiction narratives that are set within that world. But this doesn't abide by that. You know, I love that, and there really are. You know, if you are a crime fiction fan, certainly you'll love this book. But if you're a horror fan, I think you'll. I mean, to me, I read a good amount of horror, and there's maybe a handful of scenes in this that are some of the scarier things I've ever read. You know, some really profoundly scary scenes, and that brings me to my next question, which is, you know, there's also a lot of, and I think this is something we have in common in our backgrounds a little bit in our writing. There's a lot of religion in this book, and I think, you know, I grew up in a Catholic Italian American family in Brooklyn. That's not, you know, it's very different in some ways, but there's still the Catholic kind of the imagery and the statues and
all your guilt.
Yeah, the guilt, you know, all that stuff we definitely have in common. But this is a novel that deals in some really profound ways, I should say, with religion and violence. And you know, there's a lot of questioning on Mario's part about faith and belief and God, and like, you know, again, coming back to what I said earlier, just kind of, you know, the sorts of questions I think people will ask themselves when they're in the position that he's in, when they've suffered the kind of loss he's in, like how could there be a God when, you know, so, and there's also all the kind of religious iconography and all sorts of stuff laced throughout this book that is connected in some way. So can you talk about that, and also a lot of kind of philosophizing on Mario's part of the connection between religion and violence. So talk about that a little bit and kind of, you know, how that filters into your work.
In Zero Saints, there's a lot of nonfiction, and there's a little bit of writing in there about my own grandma, who had a very small apartment, and she had 2 bathrooms, and one of the bathrooms was the bathroom for the spirits, and that's where she kept the big candles and stuff, and you weren't supposed to go in there because she lit that up and did her prayers and stuff. She carried a whole bunch of milagritos on her bra. She had prayer cards like tucked all over her body. When I moved away and moved to the U.S., I realized she was the embodiment of this syncretism that you know, permeates the Caribbean. And so that made me go back and start thinking about, like, all right, so you lived in a neighborhood, in your neighborhood you had some Christians, some Jews, and a couple of Rastafarians from Jamaica, and then you had your voodoo folks and your Santeria folks and Mesa Blanca and Palo Mayo, and everybody had like something different going on. So there was never a discussion on like whose gods are right.
Yeah.
It was like as long this sort of innate understanding. If you're a good person, if you're decent, it doesn't matter what you call that shining light, or you know, if you go to church on Sundays, or if your grandma slices a chicken's neck because that's how you do your thing instead of going to church. And then as I grew up, I started realizing, so this set of religions that we have all across the globe that I at the beginning saw as a guiding light, it's the same excuse that they use for, like, you know, pray the gay away.
Yeah.
It's like, oh wow, really? So you're gonna take this thing and make it as dark and horrible as it is? And since then, I've been playing with religion, because it's everywhere. Everywhere that I look, I find religion. A student once asked me, like, do you mean absolutely everywhere? And I was like, I assure you, because when I was a teenager, I remember watching my first porn, and the lady was saying, oh God. So it's absolutely everywhere. So I'm not lying, it's everywhere. You know, in here, he has the normal religion where he starts, and then he encounters other things. And then those other things make him sort of question, you know, as Bill was saying, what kind of world is it where children die, where children go hungry? Like, we have this benevolent God. Why are so many innocent people suffering? And then that happens in many religions. People die, people suffer, people get sick. There's injustice, and we're all hoping for that interventionist, you know, presence to give us the miracle that we deserve, or that we believe that kids deserve. And when he shatters internally, his faith goes with him. But then I've also encountered the non-religious folks in life who, as soon as things go south, they turn to God or some other, you know, deity. It's kind of like, all right, I like to call them the oh shit religious people. Like, they don't remember their religion until there's like an oh shit moment. So he has plenty of those in the book, which forces him to sort of go back, like, hey, you're still an ass, but I want to apologize, God. Like, if you could throw me a bone here. And he keeps going back to that, and then abandoning it, and going back. It's something that, for people who grew up with it, like you did, you can't just unplug it and move through the rest of your life. It's part of your DNA, especially if it comes from, you know, your entire family on both sides. It's in your blood.
Yeah. And the same thing is, you know, what you were talking about with good and bad characters earlier. I mean, you know, it's one of the strengths of the book, I think, is that it's never a one-dimensional takedown of religion on the whole. I mean, it's complicated, it's messy, it's you know, it's you see both the power of it and the promise of it, but you also see the destruction it causes and the horrible things. You know, so I mean, it's a really complicated portrait of how religion is kind of, you know, just cooked into society and cooked into the lives of these characters. And you know, getting back to violence for a second, I mean, I think some of the violence in the book is shocking. There's kind of, you know, I mean, if you're not a horror fan, some of the violence might be really shocking to you, because it's kind of like got that gore factor. Like, if you like that, you'll really like the way Gabino writes violence, I think. It's not always that way, but there are definitely scenes within the book, and there's also, you know, there's a lot of reflections on violence in the book. You know, Mario thinking about kind of, you know, the way people think about violence, and kind of, you know, in movie terms, and then what it's really like, how it's quick, how it's messy, how it's, you know. So can you talk a little bit about writing violence in this book? Because there's a lot of it. I mean, it's not a book that shies away from violent encounters and violent scenes, but it's also, you know, it's not a book that glorifies it in any way. I think, you know, so it's complicated, it's messy, it's multidimensional. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'm glad you brought up movies as a movie guy that you are. there's this fine line between scenes in movies that make me uncomfortable
Yeah.
and the Tarantino stuff that's cartoonish,
Right.
which is extremely more violent and gory, but you laugh, you get a chuckle out of it.
Yeah.
And when I go into a book, I know I'm going to get all the hatred because of the use of Spanish. So that means that I don't have to be careful about pissing people off for any other reason. It's like they're gonna, if they hate that part,
Yeah.
they're not even gonna, they're not gonna pay attention to the other part. I remember getting hate mail about the Spanish in Zero Saints, and I was like, there's Italian, German, and Russian in that book.
Yeah.
No one said anything. It's the Spanish that makes them angry. I decided at some point that I was gonna take the hardcore violence that I enjoyed so much in horror fiction, but that any time that I allowed myself to use it, I needed to have a reason. It needed to fit the story,
Right.
and it needed to have some sort of psychological, emotional background, and it needed to be valid. Otherwise, it just turns into like, when you see a Donnie Yen fight and it goes into the 7 minutes, you're like, all right, I get it. They're both really good.
Yeah, it's choreography.
It's a beautiful choreography. They got 7 cameras going, but at some point it becomes repetitive.
Yeah.
You're like, how many times are they going to do some of the same moves? So in this book, it was, all right, I have an agent waiting for it. Can I do the exact sort of level of violence that I did in the previous two? Because you know that indie publishing doesn't care.
Yeah.
They're like, you want to kill 100 puppies? Let's go. Put them in a blender. We'll publish it. And in this case, I knew it was going to be a different, a different type of system when the book went into the hands of others. But I decided, it's so ugly, it's so dark, and there's a lot of things that I want to say. For example, there's one of the scenes that you're talking about. I'm not going to spoil it. We call it the bolt cutter scene.
Oh yeah. Oh man.
It's actually about religion
Yeah.
and the power of religion and the lengths to which people will go because they believe in something.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of love in that scene.
Yeah.
There's a lot of care in that scene. And it's also brutal because people come up to me and they ask me if I'm okay because I wrote it. So, I can't pull back now. I can't tell my 12 readers that have been with me, Bill and my other 11 readers that have been with me for my entire career, that I'm gonna pull back now because I have a bigger publisher. It's what I do, so I have to keep it up. I have to do it exactly as it shows up in my brain. And if John Wick can kill 500 guys because they killed his puppy, violence is acceptable.
And that does what I mentioned at the beginning about the kind of momentum in this book and the kind of what I guess, I don't know if it's the right term to use, but kind of almost the punk kind of aesthetic of the book, where it's just kind of this howl of anger and vengeance that drives this character in a lot of ways. That really, factors into. I lost the thread of what I was saying. I'm sorry. I was thinking ahead to the next question I was going to ask, and I lost what I was saying. But anyway, you did bring up you brought up a couple of things that I want to tie into the next question. The fact that, with Broken River, with indie publishing, you probably didn't have pushback on things that you might have anticipated pushback on with a bigger publisher. So talk about, so there's a lot of Spanish in this book, a lot of switching, even within sentences in the book. You are vocally anti-italics. That's always been, a thing you've kind of rejected as a formatting tool, a way of othering, a foreign language or another language in an English book. So did you get pushback on that? How does that work with, translation even? I know your work has been translated into French and other languages. Could you talk about that just a little bit?
With other languages, it's really weird because they try to get as close to 100% English as they can, because they don't want to hire two translators.
Right.
So
they're not doing that.
They're not doing that.
Okay.
And then there are certain things that they will allow as long as you get it from context 100%,
Okay.
or when there's no other word,
Yeah.
right? Every language has those words, those sayings
Right.
that you cannot translate.
Yeah.
And then you start going with it, well, it's sort of kind of like, and then you
Yeah.
lost the entire meaning, it doesn't punch anymore. But with this one in the US, I was very lucky in that the editor had read my previous work. So he knew about, if you're going to use italics in my books, put the English in italics, because that's the other language for me.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's the different one. So he knew about that part, and he was fine with it. I did think I had a chance that the agent was going to like it, because she read
Right.
the first 30,000 words, and she was very excited about it. And I was like, all right, so if she loves it, she might sell it to a bigger publisher. So let me work 100% on making sure that readers can get the gist of what's going on.
Right.
It's not about pushing them away at any point in
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
I also don't want to baby them, because
Yeah.
I taught ESL classes to undocumented workers, and sometimes they will get, ladies who clean hotels. Someone will stop them in the middle of the thing. Hey, lady, do you know where I can find the ice machine? And then they'll freeze. It's like, I don't know what this person's talking about. I don't speak
Yeah.
English. So if monolingual English speakers can go in there and from time to time feel a little bit uncomfortable, mission accomplished. Well,
Yeah.
welcome to my life. I can tell this story now because the thing is out. The profile for the New York Times, I sat with the guy, and we were an hour and a half into our conversation, and I was telling him about my grandma. And then I remembered the story where she would never put peroxide on my wounds when I scraped my knees. She would have her pack of dogs lick my wounds because the saliva of the
Yeah.
dogs healed. And as I was talking to him at a coffee shop, my brain remembered oxygenada. It did not remember peroxide. So it's one of those things where there's always a glitch that
Yeah, yeah.
reminds me, you're very comfortable with it. You've taught in English. You can sustain conversations for as long as you need to. And then once in a while, one word will fly away like a bird.
Yeah.
And you're sitting there trying to explain, the thing with the bubbles that you put in the...
Yeah.
And you sound very eloquent when you start saying the thing that you put in the... So that level of discomfort, if I can cause that in others, mission accomplished.
Yeah.
Welcome to the club.
Now, I know that the book's been chosen for the Book of the Month Club, and did they kind of push on you that you had to make a glossary?
They didn't push. They said, we're going to buy it for Book of the Month Club, and I was like, yes. And then 24 hours later, they said, in very, convoluted, respectful way, they said most of our readers are soccer moms who might not know a word of Spanish. Would you like to help us? Because you have Puerto Rican Spanish, border Spanglish,
Yeah.
Mexican, like 100% pure Mexican Spanish. So there's like 4 or 5 types of Spanish in the book. We can't hire 5 people. Would you help us for free? And so it's Book of the Month Club. I said, okay, I'll do it. And they didn't touch the book, but they put a translation guide booklet thing together. And if you order that one, you get the book and the little translation booklet.
Brings me a great pleasure to imagine soccer moms reading the bolt cutter scene. That'll be good.
Lots of 1-star reviews coming. That's gonna fuel my imagination for a while. Enjoy.
So let me ask maybe one. I don't know how am I doing on time. What do we got? I'll ask 1 or 2 more questions, and then I'll open it up to you all if you have any questions. So this is, as I said, it's a lot of things. It's horror, it's noir, it's kind of it's a Texas novel in a lot of ways. I don't know if you think about it that way, but the vast majority of it is set in Texas, or on the border between Texas and Mexico, but mostly in Texas. It's kind of a road novel in some ways. I mean, it's not like a road trip novel, but a lot of the action of the book is kind of driving and moving. It's a border story, and I definitely was thinking, and I felt throughout the book that the book was kind of a response, maybe, or an answer to ways border stories have been dealt with, by a certain kind of writer who has told a certain kind of story a certain way over and over again. So as a border story, and thinking about who's gotten to tell those stories previously, what were your goals, and what were you kind of responding to? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. First of all, the idea that when we say border in this country, we're talking about that Mexico border. The border is an idea.
Yeah.
Austin is not the border.
Right.
And yet, I made my living for 2 years teaching undocumented students how to speak English. Because it's just that part where you see the militarized, sort of like build the wall stuff happening, and it's not open, but the culture doesn't understand the thing that goes up and down. Language doesn't stop because you have a border patrol agent.
Yeah.
And we have, where I live in Austin right now, my next door neighbor to the left is a retired Mexican man who used to be a chef. And next to him is a couple from Mumbai. So it's sort of like, if I go down that entire block, everyone came from elsewhere. And when I meet, the 100% white Americans, is like, all right, you're not, because the country wasn't here. So let's go back to your great grandparents. Somebody got on a boat at some point in time, and crossed a lot of borders and came to take land that didn't belong to them. And when I write about borders now, it's sort of like, here's all the stuff about the border that you can't control.
Yeah.
You can't control people. You can't control the tunnels. You can't control anything. The French magazine America, which was a magazine that ran, I think you wrote for them.
I know it, but I didn't, but yeah, I know that magazine.
They ran while Trump was president. They asked me to research and write about guns. Mexican cartels can't buy guns.
Right.
Because there's one place in the entire country where you can get guns. It's controlled by the government. So they get the guns from us. So all that violence, all those, every murder that happens is with an American gun. And the cartels are so bad because they produce the drugs. Sure, they produce the drugs and they get it across because they're not, shooting, snorting, eating, smoking it. It's on this side of the border.
Right.
That's the problem is on this side. So it's a give and take that's really weird. And when you hear about the border, there's more caravans coming to the border. It's like this single idea of how the border operates. And it's not. I was born in a colony, so there's political borders I have to deal with, language borders and barriers I have to deal with, and I have an American passport, so I can go to Juarez and come back on the same day without a problem. But there's other things that I wanted to talk about that also have to do with the idea of borders. Hopefully people will realize that it's more nuanced than you see on TV.
That's very, and it definitely, I think, kind of shatters some perceptions, especially if your exposure is kind of that one-dimensional idea of what the border means. It shatters, just in what you were just talking about, the way guns are filtered from this side, from the American side. One of many things in the novel that are so dealt with deftly and so complicated and so complex and really addressed in a meaningful way within the framework of this crime narrative. One last question from me, and then you guys can ask questions if you have any. So if you know Gabino, beyond his fiction, he's a great literary citizen, always talking about other people's work, always reviewing books, just a great great voice out there, always kind of, you know, doing that work. So I just wanted to ask you quickly at the end, you know, generally, either in terms of influences on this book, you've talked, I know, about Sean Cosby, a mutual friend of ours, David Joy, Celio Garcia Moreno Garcia, sorry. Who else? Stephen Graham Jones, who you mentioned earlier. I thought, you know, Cormac McCarthy gets mentioned in the book, and obviously there's a little bit of tangling with him. I thought of Yudi Herrera a bunch. So any influences on the book that kind of have gone, you know, under discussed, or that you want to talk about, and or what have you been reading lately that you love?
So that was weird because before I started writing this book, I had a conversation with my students about what exactly reviewers meant by muscular prose. And I was like, wow, this is going to be tough. Because when we talk, for example, about pacing, I'm like, read James Elroy.
Yeah.
And then you learn about economy of language and pacing. But we started this conversation about muscular prose. And I was like, well, okay, I don't. And then suddenly I was like, all right, here's the first thing that we're going to do. You're all going to go read Harry Crews. And then when I realized it was sort of a road novel, I read one of those omnibuses of Charles Wilford. Because he's so dark and yet so funny.
Yeah.
And I thought, you know, I have the darkness kind of down. I need to find moments of humor here and there to let people breathe after the, you know, when you show them the bolt cutter, no one's smiling anymore. So you have to bring that back. And then I went all the way back to Richard Lehman, because Richard Lehman has amazing books, others that are not as amazing. But he would always set up his characters, and then randomly one of them would get killed in the most brutal, violent way. And I was like, at the beginning of the novel, I was sort of mentally fighting with, are some of my characters going to die? And how? How can I make that work? How can I give you know, a character and do as much character development as I can, and try to build empathy for that character, and then just whack them. And so I went back to Richard Lehman and his way of, you know, stuff happens. Move on. There's another page coming up. Keep reading. And everyone that you just mentioned, David Joy, Sean Cosby, for bringing that Black Appalachian experience to the page. Sina Pelayo is doing something really amazing, which is she's Puerto Rican, but she was like born in Chicago.
Right.
So is that, you know, that New York has its own version of very Puerto Ricans, and Chicago does the exact same thing. They're very different. And I was like, there's a small but very strong Puerto Rican community in Texas. This character needs to have that experience of living in brown, flat Texas, but having the small island surrounded by, you know, green everywhere and blue ocean. Let me bring that. So I was reading Cynthia as well. It kind of just coalesced.
Nice. You all have any questions for Gabino?
Comments, taco recipes?
I think you covered it, Bill.
He had notes.
Yeah.
He cheated.
Came prepared. All right, well, thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you, Gabino, again for driving here and being here with us. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Square Bucks. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Richard and Lisa. Please buy a book, and Gabino will be up here signing them.
Don't get it wet.
And then we'll, you know, meet you over at the bar.
Hey.
Thanks, everyone.